Hi, Wangi.
Hi, I hope you're all good.
Folks, really
Hi,
quick.
everybody. Sorry, Emil.
My connection is not stable. Okay, I'm gonna make Terrence and Jaime also hosts. So if something happens, you can take over. Okay.
Okay. That's how you see. Terence, Amanda. So how do you we still have some time? So how will it be? Terence will give the remarks.
That was sly of you. I appreciate. I appreciate how you got in front of that.
No, don't worry. If you haven't prepared anything, I'll just do a quick,
No preparation. I guess it is gonna be just like the three of our core PIs gonna present, right?
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, I don't mind welcoming people, giving them a bit of a context for this panel, and then turning it over to Amanda and introducing you, Amanda. Let me find a bio for you online really quickly.
Just
because you said
studies with emphasis in Black studies. That's it.
I think you mentioned the Terence that you have to leave early.
Yes, because I have class at my class starts at 11.
Yeah. So I suspect that you would like to be the first to talk, and then.
Well, I mean, you and I aren't talking. It's everyone else. Yeah. So absolutely. I'm just like,
give a remark, like.
Yeah. So I can give a context for how the project came to be, thank our co-sponsors, etc. And then you can close out, thank everyone for coming. And then since I won't be here, and then
I think that's our role. Just like 2 minutes.
Amanda, is your project still Migration Without Borders, the case of the Mercosur agreement and Bolivian immigrants in Brazil?
No.
Okay, what's it called?
Global anti-Blackness and Haitian migration within the Americas.
Within the Americas.
Yeah.
Hola, Juan. ¿Estás por aquí?
Hola, Jaime. ¿Cómo estás?
Bien. Good, you are here. We are missing only Raquel, right?
Yeah. And we have Dambai and Angela in the audience.
Yeah, hi Jaime, hi Terence.
Hi.
Hi, Angela. I think you can.
Okay, I'm gonna just text Raquel. Terence and Jaime, since you're here, so the translation service, it's gonna be with Melissa or CBR.
CBSR.
CBSR.
In terms of who's paying it out?
Yeah.
I would say Melissa, because Melissa's been the one doing all that. And then otherwise we'd have to update Tracy, and we'd have to explain things to Tracy, give her a background and all that other stuff. And then it might just be easier to go through Melissa.
So did you see Melissa's email? She was checking the remaining balance.
But cannot she, doesn't it need to be billed to, maybe not to the, what am I saying? Hold on.
And she says that you have 100 left.
Yeah, but that's not, that's out of what the Orphala Center gave us, right? So can't we get her to bill to the other lines of our funds,
That's
whatever?
okay. I just want to know
Yeah.
what to tell her in terms of, you know, that she can go ahead and do that. So that's it. I'll take care of that with her.
Yeah, just tell her that we have that the Orphala Center had committed funds, but that also we had from the Dean's Office and the Vice Chancellor of Research on top of SSRC. So we should have the funds. It's just probably a matter of her figuring out what code to submit through to what's the name of the place? ISBR.
Okay. So just to let you all know, it's 10 a.m. Our mics are on. We have a few people in the audience. So we're gonna just wait a little bit more. And I would like to ask you for those, let me see, mics are on. Let's just give maybe 2 more minutes. And I'll walk you through our translation channel. And please remember, that's the first time I work with that. The Zoom really allows us to do that, but it's a little bit complicated, right? We have 2 channels, we have 2 interpreters. So bear with me if we have any tech issue, okay?
Hi, oh, sorry, the connection dropped, but I'm back.
I'm just talking. Also gonna say,
Terrence, you were saying something?
well, you said we're live, as in people have been admitted. Never mind. I'll just put it in the chat.
We are waiting for Raquel. Okay, Raquel is there. Let me just add her as panelist. All right, Raquel is here. Raquel, can you hear us?
Estão me ouvindo bem?
Sim. Can you hear us well?
Ótimo.
Excellent. All right, so I think we have everything.
Yes.
Start. Terrence, Professor Terrence Witten, would you please do the opening remarks?
First, hi and welcome. Good morning and good evening to some people, depending on where you are, perhaps good afternoon. My name is Terrence Wooten. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Black Studies at University of California, Santa Barbara, where I was also a fellow in the Center for Black Studies Research. And I am here with my colleague, assistant professor, Dr. Jaime Alves, the two of us were lead co-PIs on a project funded through the Social Science Research Council entitled Enduring Social Inequalities, Black Communities' Responses in the COVID-19 Crisis in Brazil, Colombia, and Kenya. This came as a funded project through their rapid response grants that were really intended to look at community responses to COVID-19 on the ground. And we wanted to center the voices of community members and activists in Brazil, Colombia, and Kenya. And that's what this panel is a culmination of that ongoing and yet rapid research that we've been completing. So the rest of the folks on that you'll meet shortly are the other either co-PIs or our research assistants in the field doing the work. One of whom is a stellar, if I might say, graduate student here in the Department of Global Studies, Amanda Pinheiro, who will be our moderator today, and she will introduce the panelists. Amanda, before I introduce Amanda, I guess I should say that I want to thank, not I should say, it's necessary to say that this fund started as a small grant from SSRC, and it really would not have been possible to do the work that we're doing in the way that we're doing, which is not just culminating in this forum, but also in a special issue in CALFU of Journal of Comparative Ethnic Studies. If it had not been for the support of the Orfila Center for Global and International Studies here at the University of California, Santa Barbara, particularly the director, Paula Mars, support the Center for Black Studies Research and the director, Sharon Tediga, the Vice Chancellor, Joe Incandela, in the Office of Research, who also provided support for this project, Charlie Hale, who's the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences here at UCSB, who has been very enthusiastic and collaborative with us and helped this research propel forward. So it's been a team effort of multiple different stakeholders who've invested in this project and made it come to life. And so they're not on the screen, but they are just as much as part of this project and making it happen as the amazing panelists that we have today. Now, without further ado, I will introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our panelists. Our moderator is Amanda Pinheiro, who grew up in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. After receiving her diploma in journalism, she worked as a reporter for different publications, denouncing cases of corruption, reporting on the economic and social costs of the drug cartels, and scrutinizing Rio's policymaking system. In 2010, Amanda left her award-winning career as an investigative reporter to join academia, and we could not be happier and more fortunate. She completed a Master of Arts in Latin America and Latino Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where her interest in migration studies first began, and she is currently working on her dissertation project entitled Global Anti-Blackness and Haitian Migration Within the Americas. Welcome again. Thank you to Amanda, and I will turn it off to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Witten, for this warm introduction. I would like to first thank all of you for being here and start introducing our panelists. But before doing that, I would like to announce that we have a simultaneous translation service, right? So for those who are in the audience and would like to listen in Spanish, there is the English channel. If you look in the bottom to the right side of your screen, there is a little icon called interpretation. So you can just click there and change the two languages. Really quick for Portuguese speakers. Para aqueles que estão na audiência e gostaria de ouvir a nossa interpretação em espanhol, só precisa mudar o botãozinho que tem aqui do lado direito da sua tela, e aí clica, vai ter uma bandeirinha ou um ícone que mostra a troca de línguas, e a nossa tradução simultânea está pronta. Se tiver alguma dúvida, pode me mandar uma mensagem aqui pelo chat. And now I'll go back to the introduction of our panelists. I'm going to start with Juan Quiñones, who is speaking from Colombia. He's representing the group of 3 researchers, right, that we had in Colombia, and the association El Chontaduro. Next, we have Raquel de Souza, speaking from Brazil, on behalf of a program organization, UNEAFA Brazil. and Wong Kimari from Kenya. It's a Matari Center. So can you all hear me? Is everybody there? Yeah. So Juan, sí. Okay. Juan, would like to start? ¿Quieres empezar? Juan is going to be presenting in Spanish.
Bueno, bien. Buenas tardes en Colombia y en Brasil. Buenos días en Estados Unidos y buenas noches a nuestros hermanos que nos escuchan desde África y Kenia. Como dijo Amanda, mi nombre es Juan David Quiñones. Estoy en Cali, en Colombia. Hago parte de la Asociación Casa Cultural El Chontaduro y soy del equipo de investigación, del grupo de investigación Interseccionalidades, al igual que Ángela Mañunga y Denbay Mornan, que están aquí escuchándonos. La presentación del día de hoy va a estar dividida en 3 momentos. Tengo un problema para compartirla, no sé qué sucede. Pero voy a estarles conversando mientras logro solucionarlo. Decía que mi presentación va a estar dividida en 3 momentos. El primero de ellos está relacionado con el contexto de la población negra en Cali, en Colombia. El segundo de ellos tiene que ver con la pandemia, cómo la afrontó la comunidad negra en Cali, en Colombia, y cuáles fueron los hallazgos, y además de eso, las agencias y todas las tareas que emprendió la comunidad negra en Cali para afrontar de mejor manera esta crisis. Bien, empezar por decir que no estuvimos ajenos, el grupo de Colombia, a las dificultades de esta pandemia. Hubo muerte de familiares, dificultades económicas, algunos de nosotros tuvimos que fortalecer y apoyar las redes de apoyo para ayudar a nuestras familias. Hubo desempleo, hambre y demás necesidades. Bueno, entonces inicio con la contextualización de la población negra en Colombia, diciendo que estamos ubicados sobre la franja del Pacífico, ¿sí?, al occidente de Colombia, y ahí se ubica la ciudad de Cali, que es la tercera ciudad más importante de Colombia. La ciudad de Cali históricamente ha albergado gran población negra.
Juan, desculpa, ¿puedes compartir su tela ahorita?
Bien.
¿Sí? ¿Bien? Ok.
¿La están viendo?
Casi un momento. Sí, ahorita sí.
Bien, bien. Les decía, este es Cali, en el contexto de Colombia, Suramérica, y esta franja que estoy mostrando aquí es donde está ubicada la mayor población negra de Colombia, para contextualizar al público. Comienzo por decir que vamos a estar mostrando muchos mapas para ubicarnos, y los mapas sirven para explicar bien el contexto. Por eso tenemos en la presentación varios mapas. Siguiendo con ello, el contexto de la población negra en Cali, hay que decir que mucha de la gente que ha llegado a esta ciudad ha llegado a causa del desplazamiento forzado, a causa de la guerra que se vive en los territorios periféricos del país, ¿sí? Y la población llega prácticamente a una sola zona, ¿sí?, que es lo que conocemos el oriente de la ciudad, es la periferia de la ciudad. En su gran mayoría, casi que el 80% de la población llega a esta zona. Y esta zona de la ciudad es la zona que tiene los mayores niveles de empobrecimiento, de hambre, de falta de acceso a la educación, al trabajo, y lo vemos aquí en el color marrón. En el color marrón encontramos que coincide con estos datos que les estoy dando, coincide con el gran número de población negra que vive allí, en esta periferia. Y vemos que al lado derecho de la pantalla en el mapa encontramos que la mayor parte de los homicidios, de muertes se da en ese mismo sector, ¿sí? Y se da en ese mismo sector en algo particular. La edad es algo que hay que analizar bien. La mayoría son jóvenes negros entre 14 y 28 años, ¿sí? De todas estas comunidades que estoy señalando aquí. ¿Sí? El trabajo de la comunidad que habitamos este sector, porque yo también lo habito, es en su gran mayoría las mujeres al empleo doméstico, la venta en las calles, ventas ambulantes, y los hombres a las construcciones no calificadas, construcciones que se dan en el sur de la ciudad, la parte rica de la élite de la ciudad. Y entonces todo el día los padres, nuestros padres están trabajando mientras nosotros, sus hijos, estamos solos en las calles, en las casas, al cuidado de nadie, ¿sí? Mientras nuestros padres están al trabajo, al servicio de esta élite del sur de la ciudad, ¿sí? La violencia homicida, ¿sí? El perfilamiento racial hace que la mayoría de estos jóvenes que mueren, en su gran mayoría, sean negros. Sin embargo, hay algo que anotar y es que en las estadísticas solamente se discrimina por género, ¿sí? Hombres, pero no por raza, ¿sí? No hay una diferenciación étnica, pero sabemos que al estar en su gran mayoría estos homicidios en esta zona de la ciudad, sabemos que son nuestros jóvenes y los que lo vivimos diariamente vemos que los que mueren son jóvenes de la comunidad negra. Bien, ese es el contexto de la población negra en Cali, ¿sí? Vemos además de este contexto, vamos a pasar propiamente al momento de la pandemia, cómo lo afrontamos. Y los mapas siguen mostrándonos una diferencia, una diada entre lo negro y lo no negro, ¿sí? Vemos que la incidencia, el número de casos en su gran mayoría se da en la zona rica de la ciudad, pero la letalidad, la muerte, no se ensaña o no se concentra en esta zona blanca, ¿sí? Se disemina en el resto de la ciudad, las muertes. O sea que el COVID en la ciudad de Cali tiene un patrón de racialización, ¿sí? En el que quienes más se contagian no necesariamente son los que mueren, porque los que más mueren son las personas que estamos en la periferia. Bien, eso además de todas las dificultades que trae, encontramos que el gobierno local, la alcaldía, no focaliza la ayuda en términos de étnico-raciales, ¿sí? Si bien en los datos y en las estadísticas se sabe que la población negra es la que está más empobrecida, las ayudas no fueron enfocadas a ayudar a esta población, ¿sí? Pero además de eso, la sociedad civil constantemente infundió por las redes sociales mensajes de odio, ¿sí? En los que algunos de ellos, por ejemplo, aquí los tengo, mostraron división. Por ejemplo, algunos decían que el alcalde de la ciudad debería hacer un muro para separar esa parte de la ciudad y que toda esa gente muriera. Algunos decían, el alcalde debería, aquí hay uno que dice que el alcalde debería repartir comida envenenada para toda esta zona, para que toda esta gente y sus críos, sus hijos, mueran, ¿sí? Porque en el imaginario de la ciudad de Cali, la gente negra era quien estaba diseminando el virus, ¿sí? Pero ¿por qué decían esto? Porque era la gente que no podía guardar cuarentena, ¿sí? La cuarentena se volvió un privilegio para la gente que sí tenía sus trabajos, que podía trabajar desde la virtualidad, pero vuelvo y digo, la gente negra no tiene en Cali esa posibilidad, en su gran mayoría, de trabajar desde sus casas, primero porque no tienen acceso a internet, computadores y medios para hacerlo, entonces había que salir de alguna manera a la calle a rebuscarse la comida y la subsistencia. Por eso muchos decían que al estar la gente en la calle, la gente negra, había que o separarla o en una especie de apartheid o simplemente repartir comida envenenada, como algunos decían, para que todos muriéramos en esta zona. Estos mensajes no son nuevos, se dan cada que hay una tragedia, un evento donde hay que acusar a alguien, es la población negra la que sufre esta problemática de exclusión y de muerte también simbólica, además de la física que padecen nuestros jóvenes como yo, también la muerte simbólica constantemente. En pandemia también vimos la muerte de 5 jóvenes, ¿sí? En el momento en el que más alto estaba el número de casos, se presentó el asesinato de 5 jóvenes a manos de trabajadores de un cañaduzal. Un cañaduzal en Cali, particularmente en esta región del país, es a base de monocultivos que sacan la caña de azúcar, ¿sí? Y esto tiene un antecedente histórico, porque en la colonia, ¿sí?, las personas negras, el pueblo negro, era esclavizado para sacar la caña de azúcar de este territorio. Y constantemente vemos cómo, no solamente en este caso en particular, en la muerte de estos jóvenes en estos sembrados de caña, murieron, sino que constantemente vemos mujeres violadas, asesinadas, y estos jóvenes asesinados por parte de trabajadores de este cañaduzal, ¿sí? Esa muerte de estos jóvenes lo que generó fue una movilización grande de la población negra de Cali y de Colombia en torno a esta muerte, porque no solamente estaba muriendo la gente de COVID, también estaba muriendo a manos de la policía, a manos de trabajadores de estos terrenos de grandes industrias cañeras, ¿sí?, de la industria que produce la caña. Y eso lo que generó fue, como ya decía, volcarse a las calles, a manifestarse en dolor de estos jóvenes y de los que habían fallecido también anteriormente por esos días a manos de la policía y de los grupos armados, ¿sí? Eso generó masivas manifestaciones en Cali por estos jóvenes que fueron además revictimizados, porque en esta zona donde viven estos jóvenes, que es muy cerca de aquí, es un barrio que se construyó, en su mayoría casi el 100% son víctimas del conflicto armado, un barrio que construyó el gobierno en unas casas muy pequeñas, donde hay hacinamiento, y son revictimizados, huyen de la violencia en los campos, llegan a la ciudad y mueren a causa de las balas de la policía o de la élite, ¿sí? Entonces hay una doble victimización, no hay seguridad en ningún lugar de este territorio pareciera para la gente negra. Estamos constantemente sometidos a un no lugar, ¿sí? Es un no lugar donde no estamos bien ni en nuestros territorios ni a donde llegamos, ¿sí? Siguiendo con esto, en la pandemia, a causa de la pérdida de trabajo, hallamos varias historias conocidas, cercanas. Por ejemplo, en un foro que tuvimos más interno de Colombia, una de las mujeres en el foro contaba que su amiga, los jefes le habían dicho que no podía irse de esa casa donde trabajaba, esa casa rica, porque si se iba no podía seguir trabajando con ellos, porque seguramente si se iba a su territorio volvería a ellos y los contagiaría. O sea que ella tenía que arreglárselas como fuera para mandar dinero, haciendo la aclaración de que no le aumentaron el sueldo, por el mismo sueldo tenía que quedarse esos 2 meses encerrada en esa casa, trabajando para esa familia rica, y sus hijos al cuidado y a la suerte de ellos mismos, o sea, cuidándose entre ellos porque no tenían a nadie a su cargo, ¿sí? Esa es la realidad que viven las familias negras en Cali y en Colombia. ¿Sí? Como esta historia creímos que había sido algo aislado, pero después investigando vimos que fueron muchas, ¿sí? Conversando con la comunidad nos dimos cuenta de que muchas de estas historias se repitieron. En la educación, por ejemplo, uno de los jóvenes de la Casa Cultural Chontadulo nos cuenta que en su casa él tuvo que entre decidir si dejaba de estudiar o ir a trabajar para comer, y él dijo que con hambre no se estudiaba, así que tuvo que salir a buscar comida para ayudarle a su mamá en los gastos de la casa, ¿sí? Entonces, eso fue lo que sucedió en pandemia. La gente tuvo que resolver la vida. Esta mujer tuvo que quedarse encerrada en una casa, cuidando hijos de una familia rica y sus hijos al cuidado de ellos mismos, se tenían a ellos mismos. Una de las mujeres mayoras, como le llamamos acá por respeto a las mujeres adultas de la comunidad, decía que la pandemia no era algo nuevo, o sea, no le tenía miedo a la pandemia, a morir por el COVID, porque simplemente era una nueva forma de morir, ¿sí? Ella dice, esto es una nueva forma de morir, así que a mí si me toca salir a la calle a resolver el alimento, la comida, yo tengo que hacerlo, porque el COVID es una nueva forma, me matan en el territorio, me matan llegando aquí a la ciudad, me matan constantemente. Entonces esta es una nueva forma de morir, así que no le tengo miedo a esta nueva enfermedad. Esa fue como una realidad cruda que se vivió en pandemia para la gente negra en Cali, en Colombia. Además de eso, quiero anotar también que durante estos meses y hasta ahora se está viendo un desplazamiento masivo, ¿sí? Donde en territorios como Buenaventura, Tumaco y algunos del Chocó están siendo desplazados a las ciudades nuevamente, aún después de que hace más o menos 5 años se firmó un proceso de paz. La guerra vuelve a aparecer y la guerra se ensaña con las poblaciones negras. Así que estamos viendo nuevamente llegar a la ciudad gran población negra desplazada por la guerra, ¿sí? Desde hace más o menos un mes se vive un enfrentamiento entre disidencias o grupos que pertenecían a la guerrilla, que se han vuelto a reorganizar y que están generando desplazamiento. Ese es un poco del contexto en cuanto a la pandemia en Cali, un breve contexto. Pero bien, también la comunidad se unió en torno a resolver la vida de alguna manera, ¿sí? No esperando esas ayudas que en su mayoría no llegaron, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, en las casas hubo un movimiento de los trapos rojos, en las ventanas, afuera de las casas, la gente ponía un trapo rojo, una bandera roja en símbolo de necesidad, de que en esa casa necesitaban comida, se estaba aguantando hambre. Ese movimiento hizo que en la mayoría de los barrios de Cali, del oriente, de la periferia, las personas en sus casas sacaran una bandera roja en señal de necesidad. Además de eso, en las calles se hizo ollas comunitarias, ¿sí? Donde la gente en símbolo de solidaridad llevaba a alguien el arroz, otra persona llevaba la carne, otra persona llevaba la papa, y en símbolo de solidaridad se unían todos estos alimentos y se cocinaba en la calle para suplir las necesidades de alimento que se tenía en ese momento. Aquí vemos las imágenes, eso fue en todo el oriente se vio, en toda la periferia de la ciudad se vieron estas ollas comunitarias, community posts, como dice aquí. Además de eso, también en símbolo de soberanía alimentaria, de food security, las personas sembraron en los territorios que tenían, en lo que podían sembrar, entonces intercambiaban productos. Si alguien sembraba aguacate, yo sembraba plátano, compartían para complementar y así hacer la ración de alimentos. Es algo muy similar a lo de las ollas, en este caso sembrar, porque en algún momento los alimentos empezaron a escasear y a encarecerse. Entonces la gente negra en su mayoría sembró sus propios alimentos y se continúa haciendo, ¿sí? Porque la crisis continúa. No fue algo transitorio, sino que sigue en el tiempo, es continuado en el tiempo. Además de eso, en la Casa Cultural El Chontaduro, donde yo pertenezco, a la organización a la que asisto, decidimos reunirnos para socializar quién tenía un amigo doctor, una amiga enfermera, para en el momento de que alguien de la comunidad, alguien cercano, tuviese una gravedad por COVID o por cualquier otra enfermedad, tuviera la posibilidad de contar al menos con un médico amigo o una médica amiga que pudiera ayudar a solventar su problema, ayudar su problema de salud que se presentara en algún momento. Asimismo, en ayudas psicosociales, psicólogos y psicólogas se unieron para, por medio de llamadas, ayudar a la gente en consultas psicosociales. En este momento donde no había ni siquiera acceso a la comida, pues mucho menos acceso a buena calidad en salud mental. Entonces lo que hicimos fue llamar amigos psicólogos, psicólogas, reunirnos y poder agenciar las consultas psicológicas. Sí, también se realizó un concierto donde diferentes artistas de la ciudad se unieron, ¿sí? Para recaudar fondos y poder ayudar a las familias que más lo necesitaran, ¿sí? Este concierto se realizó el año pasado, se reunió un dinero y con ese dinero se compró alimento para estas familias. Esas fueron las grandes acciones que se realizaron. Además de eso se realizaron folletos, publicidad de prevención con rostros más cercanos a la comunidad, rostros de personas negras, porque la mayoría de la publicidad de prevención se hizo con la representación de personas blancas. ¿Sí? En este caso lo hicimos procurando que la gente se sintiera representada, ¿sí? Y pudiera prevenir también todo el problema de distanciamiento social, de lavado de manos, de las caretas. Entonces, esas fueron en su mayoría las grandes acciones. En conclusión, ¿sí? Para cerrar, lo que pudimos encontrar es que la gente negra definitivamente salva a la gente negra, ¿sí? Nos tocó asumir una posición de autoayuda, ¿sí? Autopreservación. En esa día de estar siempre en un no lugar, ¿sí? Nos tuvimos siempre a nosotros. Nos tuvimos siempre a nosotros, en la fraternidad, en la hermandad, en la unión. Y este racismo estructural sistémico, pues no ha sido nuevo. Esta pandemia lo que hizo fue recrudecer, exacerbar todas estas problemáticas, y lo que hizo la comunidad fue volcarse a ayudar a la misma comunidad. Siempre ha sido así, no solamente ha sido ahora, en términos de también cuando en las comunidades se han visto golpeadas por la guerra, ha sido de la misma manera. Las personas que llegan a causa del desplazamiento siempre la primera ayuda que tienen es de la misma comunidad, ¿sí? Encontramos que no hay una atención diferencial, ¿sí? Para estos casos, y casi que nunca. Entonces, la importancia de siempre reafirmar que las comunidades son las que agencian sus propias estrategias, es importante rescatarlo. Eso es todo por ahora. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas en Brasil, en Estados Unidos, en Kenia y en el resto de ciudades que nos escuchan.
Juan, thank you very much for sharing the situation of the pandemic in Cali. Muchas gracias por compartir el contexto de la pandemia en Cali con nosotros. We're going to have opportunity to ask some questions to Juan, but right now I'd like to pass on to Dr. Raquel de Souza, speaking from Brazil, Bahia. Dr. de Souza. Let me unmute you and share.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Excellent.
Oh, good, because I'm having problems here with my Wi-Fi.
Let us know if you have any issue, but we can hear and see you well.
Good. All right, so good afternoon. First of all, thank you really for the opportunity of developing this research. It has been a very challenging experience on a number of different levels. And if I were to talk about research findings for starters, I would like to state that it's been challenging because most of us who are engaged in this research in this particular group are members of the communities that are currently, I would say, under attack, not necessarily because of the virus per se, but in light of a number of different circumstances that we could consider in the context of Brazil, of state negligence that has become really more evinced in terms of the ways, for example, that the federal government has been handling the process of organizing, or rather disorganizing, a national vaccination plan. And in light of that, if I were to talk again specifically about how the process of developing this research unfolded, it was challenging for us because while we were trying to support these communities that have been struggling under the weight of the pandemics, be it because of a lack of healthcare assistance, of good quality healthcare assistance, or because their families themselves have been struggling, and their neighbors and their neighborhoods. So we were trying to rescue ourselves, protect ourselves from the threats of the pandemics, while we were trying to help others who might have been in even more dire conditions than ourselves. And in that sense, my process of helping, and actually more learning than developing the work myself, from a couple of members from the organization UNEAFRO Brazil, with whom I worked more closely. It was an interesting experience that highlighted one of the main issues that have been evinced during this pandemics, is that Black and indigenous populations in Brazil are being more affected by the pandemics. And if we were to actually talk about that in terms of global patterns, Black and indigenous communities in the African diaspora were already affected by pre-existing structural conditions that influenced how these Black communities are impacted by COVID-19. And in that sense, the pandemics just very unfortunately came to not only evince these these structural conditions of historically accumulated disadvantages, but also exacerbate them. As we know, if we were to look at wealth disparities in the world, billionaires and millionaires have become billionaires, billionaires have expanded their fortunes, while low-income communities that had already been historically disadvantaged for a number of different patterns of disenfranchisement have become more impoverished, either because some family members who used to provide support to the families are either sick or unemployed, or because, very unfortunately, the pandemics have resulted in the ultimate consequence, which is death. And in that sense, if I were to address another question that I think should be evinced in this report, if you will, of this final report for the research, it has to do with how Black communities are responding to these compounded insecurities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And if I were to emphasize a particularly interesting, perhaps peculiar aspect of Black organizations in Brazil, I would say that the Black movement has been particularly after, can you hear me? I hear a little noise in the background.
Yes, you can
I
hear
hope
me
it's
well.
not my Wi-Fi dying.
No, we're good.
Particularly as the military dictatorship in Brazil went gradually to a quote unquote demise, because unfortunately we see the resurgence of the influence and the power of military forces in Brazil in the last couple of years in light of Bolsonaro's election, but I'm going to talk about that later. But as the military dictatorship, its demise in the 80s, started to become more advanced, we had the opportunity of reorganizing Black movements in Brazil. And one of the main targets of the Black movement became organizing itself around demanding policies, affirmative action policies that would lead more Afro-Brazilians into institutions of higher learning in the country. But then if you are to investigate further the types of activities developed by these organizations through Black social movements and NGOs, you are going to find that what we call in Brazil pré-vestibulares, or SAT preparation courses, if you will, that are geared towards low-income Black students in the country, you'll see that the courses are organized in such a way that not only are they preparing these students for entrance exams in institutions of higher learning, teaching regular disciplines such as mathematics, physics, Portuguese, writing, etc. But these preparation courses, these Black-oriented preparation courses, also provide classes about African diaspora history, from a contemporary and a historical perspective, and Black citizenship and Black political engagement. And in the particular case of UNEAFRO Brazil, which I have been observing and studying their interventions in the specific context of the COVID-19 response, and it was an immediate response, as a matter of fact. They have organized through these quote unquote SAT preparation courses, once again, that in Brazil we call pré-vestibulares. They have organized themselves, raising funds both within Brazil and raising funds from international institutions in order to provide food and hygiene supplies to low-income Black communities, particularly in peripheral regions and neighborhoods of São Paulo. But they have also been working in collaboration with other Black institutions and Black social movements throughout the country, engaging in similar campaigns, and also engaging in campaigns such as the latest one that was launched on February 18th, demanding that the federal government reinstated the federal aid for struggling families during the pandemics, and also demanding that a more organized system for vaccination in the country should be set up. Because the truth of the matter is, we are currently enduring the harsh impacts of COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil, in light of the fact that there was no solid and well-organized preparation plan in order to prevent the spread of the virus in the country. The current president, actually, while we have been reaching peak numbers in terms of death rates in Brazil in the last couple of days, he continues to insist that we should go back to business as usual. He's been threatening local governors and mayors to cut down on whatever financial aid he would provide for emergency relief to these local populations in case governors insisted in the restriction measures, such as shutting down businesses, because in his mind, what needs to continue to be preserved are businesses. We need to continue to work. He's been accusing local governors of destroying jobs and preventing the economic growth of the country. He's been promoting this type of reckless behavior, not only by preventing and stalling the process of organizing a national plan for vaccination and encouraging businesses to shut down in order to curb the spread of the virus, but also he's been constantly, since the beginning of the pandemics, participating in events, in agglomerations, in social gatherings, and constantly showing up maskless. So we currently are struggling with these circumstances in which we have a federal government that has very quickly realized that the pandemics has been disproportionately affecting this particular sector of the population, which is Black and impoverished communities and indigenous communities. And the government has been basically very, very negligent in terms of providing any type of real solid plan in order to curb the spread of the virus. Because we are talking about a right-wing party. Actually, currently he has no political party because he's so reckless. His own political party, he expelled him or he left the party. So basically, he there's no accountability to his behavior. There's no accountability in terms of the behavior of the people who should be in charge of the Ministry of Health in order to provide some type of relief to struggling families or some type of vaccination plan that would curb the spread of the virus and prevent mass casualties. Because since he is a military man, he sees these deaths as war casualties. Wealthy white families in the same ways that it has been affecting impoverished Black families in the peripheries. So this is the kind of context in which the Black organized movement in Brazil has been engaging in struggles in order to preserve the lives of struggling Black families throughout the country. And particularly in the case of UNEAFRO Brazil, as you can see in the background, there is an image, a very powerful image, with a very powerful line in which UNEAFRO denounces the process of the mishandling of the pandemics in Brazil as a process of genocide, as a process of orchestrated genocide, purposeful genocide. And governors currently are trying to surpass or go beyond the federal government and taking to the Supreme Court their requests to purchase vaccines beyond all the strange bureaucracy and legislation that Bolsonaro has been hiding behind and promoting in order to slow down the process of vaccinations in Brazil. First of all, because he's a negationist, but also prior to the pandemics, we were very aware of the fact that this man has some type of love relationship with death, because one of the main symbols that he used when he was campaigning for office was holding guns in his hands. Every single time he was in any type of public event promoting his campaign, he had to make weapons signs with his hands. So we knew that he was not about life. He was not about promoting life. He is about promoting death.
So he feels very comfortable in this type of environment, and he's been really creating extreme difficulties in terms of curbing the pandemic in Brazil, which in the last couple of days has actually been reaching peak rates, peak death rates in Brazil, as a result of a combination of this process of state negligence, of mishandling of a number of different resources, actually also budget cuts. So this is the type of territory through which organizations such as UNEAFRO have been navigating. What else could I say here? What kind of pedagogies of everyday resistance have these Black communities therefore developed in order to counter the social and racial impact of the virus? Once again, going back to UNEAFRO, they have been organizing food and hygiene supply campaigns, taking this food and hygiene supplies to low-income neighborhoods and also to homeless people, which is, of course, a very stressful situation because they oftentimes put themselves at risk of contamination because they themselves live in neighborhoods in which the virus has been spreading itself very rapidly, because in a lot of these circumstances, the public healthcare system, in light of budget cuts that have been affecting Brazil, geared towards health and education in the last couple of years, had been slowly and gradually dismantling the public healthcare system in Brazil when the pandemics hit. So it's been a very interesting and actually painful, stressful experience to develop research under these circumstances because we are not those types of traditional researchers that come from elite classes in which you can just have that distanced, uncommitted, if you will, or distanced, objective look in which you look at the realities of people who are living in these low-income neighborhoods and you write about that experience. We are enduring these experiences ourselves, and producing knowledge under these conditions is highly stressful. There were circumstances in which coordinating the activities with the research assistants was challenging because they themselves were being affected by the circumstances of these pandemics. Their families were being affected. Their neighbors were being affected. But if I were to conclude for now, because I would hope to have some questions asked about this intervention, it has been also very rewarding because in many ways for us, it was a very powerful, efficient way of feeling less powerless under these circumstances, of having a sense that we actually had some type of power, some type of agency, some type of power to intervene and protect our communities under these dire circumstances. And I do hope to have the chance to continue to develop this research because this is the type of engagement that we very desperately need in Brazil at the moment, because the pace of vaccinations here is very slow, very disorganized, unemployment is rampant, the process for approving this relief aid for struggling families has been extremely slow. And these families will continue to need this type of support, and producing knowledge about the engagement of Black social movements in Brazil in the fight against historical and particularly contemporary patterns of state negligence in this country are more urgent and necessary than ever. And therefore, I would like to once again thank you for inviting me to participate in this research. I would like to thank the SSRC, the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I'd like to name names. I would like to really thank Dr. Jaime Alves for inviting me to participate in this research, for being in charge of this huge responsibility, which is observing how Black social movements are responding to the current demands under this process of genocide promoted by the COVID-19 pandemics. And I would also like to very much thank Professor Terence for his support, and Amanda Pinheiro, because she has been tirelessly struggling to support us in making sure that we were able to continue this research and conclude it successfully. Thank you so much. I do want you to ask me questions, please. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raquel de Souza. We're gonna certainly have some questions for you in the Q&A. And Dr. Kimari, if you are available, would like to pass it on you.
Hi, everyone.
On to you.
No problem. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Great.
I can hear you well. Thank you.
Well, I think it's bom dia ainda. Is it still bom dia in Brazil? I don't know if it's still the daytime in Colombia. It's definitely the morning in Santa Barbara. So good morning and good day to everyone. I hope you're good. My name is Wangui Kimari, and I am, I think I'm part of this process as someone who cares about community, and also as someone who's African, and it's really enriching for me to be part of a process that includes the African diaspora, and particularly not the English speaking one, because rarely in Kenya do we get to reflect on our pedagogies of resistance with our comrades and other Africans in Colombia or in Brazil. So I feel very privileged to be part of this process. And so today I will talk briefly about the kind of work that's been happening particularly in poor urban spaces in Kenya to mitigate and try and live through and charge against the effects of COVID in poor urban contexts in particular, although this applies broadly to other contexts in Kenya. So this is, we will see that the work that communities are doing in Kenya and poor urban communities are similar to what's happening in Brazil, in Cali as well. And it really struck me that one emphasized that COVID is just another way of dying, because our people and poor Black people have been subject to very many colonial deaths that are intentional. So COVID has just provided another unfortunate way of dying, but our people are resisting in different ways. So just to give you just to paint the picture of what's happening in Kenya over the last year because of the pandemic, like most other countries in Africa, Kenya has not had the scale of COVID victims that have transpired, unfortunately, in the US, in Europe, elsewhere. South Africa is the exception in the continent of Africa, but for a long time, and the total in Africa was significantly, and is still significantly less than what's happening in the rest of the world. In Kenya, since March, when the first case was reported, we've had in the last year roughly 2,000 deaths and about 100,000 cases, and that's just a rough figure. But certainly this has not, even if we've not had the kind of incidence of deaths and like incidence of COVID cases that are in the rest of the world, we've been really impacted on a number of fronts. And for the purposes of this talk and also the paper we're writing with Amanda, I just categorize that into 3 different sections. So these are the impact on, because of socioeconomic neglect, because of medical neglect, but also because of the hyper-policing that's historical, but that's also been exacerbated in this time where we have a lockdown and we have a curfew. And I'll talk about those 3 categories just to reflect on the impact of COVID in our context. And it's important to note that the impact is felt the greatest in poor communities, which are the apartheid geographies, and how they relate in particular to Black geographies is because the spaces where people are the most impacted by socioeconomic neglect, by medical neglect, and by hyper-policing are what Fanon calls the former native cities. So in the history of Nairobi, this iteration of Nairobi is a colonial city, Black people were not allowed to live in Nairobi. And so the spaces that are most impacted on these 3 fronts are the historically native spaces or the Black spaces. And so this is how we connect to the reflection on racism and COVID-19. And it builds on like what Juan was saying as well, and Raquel, the apartheid geographies that still exist in this city of 4 million people where at least 75% or 70% live in spaces of no sanitation, no fixed water, and these other issues. So as I reflect on these, I'll reflect on these 3 categories and then attend to the pedagogies of resistance that people have been employing to deal with these effects. So in terms of socioeconomic neglect, obviously across the board, whether it's in Kenya or in Brazil, COVID has really impacted people's livelihoods. So in Kenya, I think maybe we would say 70% of the workers are informal workers. So they don't have a fixed contract, they have a daily wage. And so the onset of the pandemic has led to the complete negation of people's incomes and livelihoods. But that's across the board. But what's also important to attend to is how they have not received the kind of support that they require. So while the government has announced a stimulus package, for the most part, the people have not received food in their houses, they've not received money in their phones or their pockets. This work has been done by different non-governmental organizations, but above all, the solidarity of neighbors or the solidarity of community-based groups who will find food for each other. And so we can see this impact greatly, this socioeconomic neglect and socioeconomic desperation in poor communities that are representative of the 7 million Kenyans who've lost their jobs, are representative of the Kenyans who are struggling to eat 1 meal a day. And so that's just some of it's also important, and I shouldn't forget to say this impact is felt greatly, not just in poor urban Kenyans, but also in refugees whose services are not continuing on the border of Kenya and Somalia because of COVID. It's felt greatly in migrants who are they are not able to social distance or don't have homes to go to, or can't engage in the different work that can give them a daily wage. It's also felt in the lives of homeless people. And so we can see this socioeconomic neglect has led to, we could say, I mean, because the deaths are not measured, but really it has, the lack of livelihoods or the impact on livelihoods has affected many communities. If we think of on the medical front, Kenya, like most countries on this, I guess people call it the late capitalist moment, which I don't know how late it is. Medical care is not, there's public health care, but it's not very good and it's very stressed. But if you have COVID at this moment, you have to pay for your own medical healthcare or medical services. And so for people who poor communities that don't have health centers close to them, that have to pay even for a COVID test. That's initially COVID tests were about $100. Just shows the disparity that exists on the medical front. The healthcare systems don't favor them. They don't have access to them. They have to pay for a COVID test that's $100. And so we can see the disparities that COVID has exacerbated and has offered a new front on which to be punitive to poor people. It's also important to note that there's really no, in the community where the center I work in or I volunteer in is based, there's no water. Water is a consistent issue. So on the medical front, you can't tell people to wash hands if you don't have water, if they haven't had, in the history of this neighborhood that's over 100 years old, a piped water network. So there's also no water. Sanitizer costs roughly half of someone's daily wage, and that's a small bottle. And also, unfortunately, because there's no healthcare systems, the burden of healthcare and caring for community members who have COVID or other diseases falls on community health volunteers. And so while community health volunteers could be anyone, could be your grandma, could be me, who volunteer to take care of people who have HIV, go door to door, make sure they're okay. Now they have to take care of people should they have COVID, but then they are forced to adhere to not deadlines, but to protocols, COVID, state-sanctioned COVID protocols that don't make sense in poor communities. For example, they're told, you can't go see someone if you don't have gloves, or if that person who has COVID in a community has to isolate in a separate room. But these are homes that have one room, they're one shack, they don't have water. The community health volunteer has to buy gloves or a full PPE equipment, and that's just not there. And we can see how, notwithstanding their this COVID, their community health workers have to, while they're taking care of people who may have COVID in the community, they have the burden of following these protocols that don't make sense, that in some ways are copy paste from rich communities or copy paste from Europe, and they're also exposing themselves. So these are the impacts on the medical front. In terms of hyperpolicing, this has been seen in particular because of the curfew. And so there's a lockdown and there's a lockdown curfew. And initially it was 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's when people were allowed to be outside. And should you be caught outside, then the police would deal with you, and it was for your own benefit, says the narrative. But this kind of really warlike response, so mercenary response to policing or the lockdown, has really led to the deaths of, for example, a 13-year-old boy in Madare who was just on his balcony in the community and was shot by the police in the first month of the lockdown. There's also been the death of a homeless person. Just today, after this call, I have to go see news about a young man who's been shot. There were 2 shot yesterday. And so you can see how COVID has also provided not just a front for more socioeconomic neglect or medical neglect, but a more warlike response to poor communities, a hyper-policing that's only seen in these former native cities. It's also allowed for more extortion, because it's now legislated that you have to wear a mask, and that's fine, sure. But if you don't wear a mask, you're subject to a $200 fine. And knowing this, the police then extort people on a daily basis if they're found not wearing masks. So it's provided this front of a lot of, just another front to surveil and to discriminate and to harass poor Kenyans. So by way of conclusion, it's important for me to talk about, so what have people been doing? What pedagogies of resistance have they been employing? These people who find themselves not just on the front line of trying to make life work in poor spaces against a lot of discrimination, but they now have to be the front line of the COVID-19 response in their communities, which they say we didn't bring. This disease came on a plane. We've never seen a plane. And yet we are the ones who have to be on the front line of it in our communities. So in terms of what our organization, Madare Social Justice Center, has been doing, we found ourselves moving from being a space that tries to convene social movements and activists and having various campaigns to literally for 3 months, we were distributing food weekly. And we never anticipated that we would be a charity organization in that regard, but for at least 3 months, we were distributing food weekly. Communities are also providing water. We provided water outside of our space so people could wash hands, and so did another organization above us called Ghetto Foundation. But in terms of water, one interlocutor from our research process shared that he has a community youth group who ordinarily, unfortunately, sell water to make a living. But during this COVID-19 moment, they have reduced significantly the cost of water or how they're costing the water. So the price of water that they're selling, because they saw the importance of that. I mean, they're using it as a livelihood measure because everyone and cartels are using it as a livelihood measure, but they reduced the price because they recognize how imperative it was at that moment. Community groups have also been documenting human rights violations in the different ways they can. And this is important to emphasize because often big NGOs try and in some ways violently ascertain or violently establish this UN standard or bureaucratic orthodox standard of recording human rights violations. But social justice centers and different groups are charging against this and documenting human rights violations in the ways that they can. In Madare, we also organize protests against the deaths of people who were killed by the police. Others are just living together. You live with your neighbor who can't pay rent. Families are moving in together. Different people are providing soap. Groups have come together to provide even sanitary ware and pads for people who find that already those are so expensive, but now in a context of really socioeconomic hardship, they're even more imperative to provide. And so these are the different things that are happening, including conversations like this that are important and allow for us to share and reflect on the different ways and learn on the different ways that communities are responding. Madare Social Justice Center also had a similar conversation, I think in July last year, with a group in Complexo de Alemão in Rio de Janeiro, who are also thinking through how to respond. And so these conversations are also important. And so against all of the advice to separate that we're told from COVID in this moment, social distance, stay away from each other, communities are finding ways to be with each other because ultimately they can't social distance, but ideologically they're coming together also to use this moment to recognize that they can never depend on the government. They never intended to, but to develop new ways of, additional ways of caring for each other and responding to each other that really respond to the present moment. And so just to conclude, I'm grateful for the chance to learn from each other, and it was really interesting to hear from both Brazil and Colombia. And I think we need to, just to find a way to keep sustaining these resistances in our communities, while also hoping that our communities don't have to respond or don't have to respond to any new violences, but just finding a way to strengthen them. And I'm grateful for this conversation to help us do this. So thank you. I think that's okay for now.
Excellent, Dr. Kimari. Thanks so much for sharing with us the perspective from Nairobi, Kenya. So we would like to open for the Q&A. So for those who are in the audience, please feel free to just add your question in the chat. And then we're gonna just open to start this conversation among our panelists. So I'll give you all some time to raise your questions. I think, well, for the sake of time, why don't we panelists start our conversation, and when we have questions in the Q&A from the audience, we can just share the questions and I can direct the questions to the panelists. But I really would like to have the opportunity to discuss, right, to create a dialogue among the three panelists plus Professor Alves. So I think I'm gonna just open the floor. And I'd like to start, and then for all three panelists, I would like to ask you, I'm pretty sure that for this research project, there were so many challenges specifically, right? But can you, maybe point one, what was the most difficult part of conducting research? And I'm talking about like on the ground, like real ethnographic work. Can you talk about the biggest challenge that you and or your research team faced in conducting research in these communities, in light of COVID-19? Feel free to open your mic, whoever's ready.
Maybe I could just say, and it's something that obviously a question that needs greater reflection, but some of the challenges were the additional surveillance, because you're not allowed to meet. Obviously that makes sense, but the fact that the police can come to our space and our office and say, you shouldn't have meetings because you're contravening social distancing protocol. So it just offers another way of surveillance that people are worried about, because they don't want to be sent to a social distancing facility that they're going to have to pay for. As an organization, if people get COVID, there's no health system that will take care of them. And so we're unable to take care of them. So all of these intersecting challenges, the surveillance, the reality that if people, you need to meet to strategize, because people, we're not going to speak over Zoom when people don't have internet bundles or computers. So you need to come together, but at the same time, coming together offers this challenge of being surveilled, the reality that if someone gets sick, there's no medical care that we can afford to pay for them. So all of these intersecting challenges.
Thank you, Dr. Imari. Can you just say a little bit more, especially here in the US, we were talking about digital exclusion, right? And you touch on a very important point, because we're saying like, now we have Zoom, we have e-learning, right? Distance learning, but in some places, it's not a possibility. There is no such a thing as computers and smartphones and Zoom and easy access to internet. So on top of that, how was the process of trying to stay connected when you really couldn't? How did you and your team manage to still communicate and organize and work together?
So in terms of, I'll speak specifically to this research process. Zoom is just not a reality. And especially if you want to talk to maybe a grandmother who doesn't have a smartphone, if she has a phone at all, and if she has credit on the phone to speak to you. So there are all of these limiting factors. There may be no credit, no electricity to charge the phone, no Zoom. And so these are, because we didn't want to only speak to the people who would have access to Zoom, because that's already a particular class power. We tried to get, at least in one section of the research, people who had smartphones to leave voice notes for me and just describing their life. But because for sure, computers are not accessible, consistent internet is not accessible. But for those who could, there were voice notes, but I also spoke with people on the phone. And that's what we had to do, because it really wasn't possible to have a forum like this with that would allow for representation of all the demographics that are in Madare community.
Thank you very much. Dr. Raquel de Souza would like to add comments on this point.
Yes, I had a very similar experience here, because we tried to organize as our closing was going to be organized online, and I thought that as a closing meeting, if you will, or event, we should have beneficiaries of these projects that are developed by UNEAFRO geared towards low-income families that are struggling, low-income Black families. And very unfortunately, the reality was that a lot of these people didn't have access to cell phones or a stable Wi-Fi connection, because UNEAFRO has actually been providing support to people who are homeless, people who are addicted to, we call it in Brazil, dependentes químicos, chemical dependents. And then how would you get these people to be organized around a focus group? Personally, because we could have otherwise perhaps been able to gather them up at UNEAFRO's facility and then have that filmed and broadcast. But unfortunately, the meeting was not possible because under the current circumstances, gathering up in a particular space, of course, could offer possibilities of contamination. And I actually would like to add something that I left out in my presentation, which is similar circumstances happening in Brazil when it comes to police surveillance, who have turned low-income Black population into their targets during these restrictions imposed by the government. Not only due to the fact that the police surveillance was very violent towards these populations. For example, we had an instance in Rio de Janeiro in which a couple of people got shot and killed while they were working and distributing food supplies in their neighborhood. Because, you know, as usually the police in Brazil argues that uh, there was drug activity in that place, and when they came to respond to whatever raid they had been requested to perform, the drug dealers were shooting at them. But these people were distributing food supplies, and a couple of them got shot and killed while they were doing that. So these are the type of circumstances that we need to also emphasize when it comes to these pandemics, which is the fact that it has authorized the state to become even more violent in their incursions into these low-income Black neighborhoods, added to the fact that we have this sensationalist police TV programs in Brazil that usually are aired for 2 or 3 hours, and they have drones flying over low-income neighborhoods, filming neighborhood activities, gatherings, and parties. While we know that the only reason why these Black low-income communities are exposed like that is because usually they organize their gatherings in the streets. Very rarely you are going to see white elite families, their festivities, their large festivities, because they have been holding these festivities in fancy, expensive nightclubs, but they are not exposed in the same ways. If we were to look at the patterns of contamination in the spread of the virus in Brazil, the very first well-known case was the case of a Black woman, a maid, who was contaminated by her patroa. I don't know a good translation for this word, but her boss, I don't know if that's a good word, but you know, whoever is in charge of the household, who had this domestic worker contaminated. And while this woman who had just come from Italy on winter vacations was, you know, the virus did not affect her that much because she already had the type of health conditions to withstand the brunt of the virus. The domestic worker, she died. That is the very first well-known case in Brazil. So that goes to show the types of dynamics that we have in this country in terms of race relations, in terms of desperate health care access, in terms of pre-existing conditions. And we also had another case that I would like to mention here, which was the case of another Black woman, a catering to a party, to a wedding, a destination wedding that took place in the interior of Bahia. And she was driving her husband's car because they were catering to this white wealthy family's wedding, and she died. So we have two cases. The first was this maid, this Black maid who died, and the second one was this pregnant Black woman whose child thankfully survived, but she died as a result of these dynamics. So who's being exposed? Who's being affected? These two cases are cases that I wanted to have mentioned during my presentation, but they go to show, they evince the type of patterns that we have in Brazil when it comes to how the pandemics is being disproportionately affecting in very deadly patterns low income Black families and people in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Souza. Juan, gostaria de compartir conosco, con nosotros una situación de desafío que su equipo de investigación encontró en Cali o usted.
Hola a todos. Las dificultades y los desafíos que nosotros en Colombia tuvimos no fueron muy diferentes a los que vimos en Kenia y en Brasil. El tema de que las personas que estaban con nosotros para hacer el trabajo de etnografía no tenían acceso a al internet. Entonces, por ejemplo, acudimos al grupo de jóvenes del Chontaduro, al que pertenecemos, y reunirnos en un lugar, ¿sí? Todos con el distanciamiento y preservando las medidas que pudiésemos tener para hacer algún tipo de conversación, entrevistas con ellos. Además de eso, también en esta tarea, pero hay gente que simplemente no tiene la posibilidad ni siquiera de responder estas preguntas o este trabajo porque tiene que resolver otras cosas, ¿no? Entonces, eso también, además de las dificultades propias, también vienen los cuestionamientos o las preguntas, ¿no? Estamos en medio de una pandemia y queriendo escuchar su voz. Hay dificultades, pero también es la frustración de no saber cómo ayudar más de lo que se pueda a estas personas, ¿no? Entonces, es muy difícil y lo confronta mucho a uno como persona que está al frente de una investigación, porque están dándole voz, pero esa persona que está ahí necesita también respuesta de su problema. Entonces, eso también está en juego en el medio de la investigación, ¿sí? Más allá también de las dificultades propias del distanciamiento, el internet, la tecnología. Sí, bien.
Gracias, Juan. Professor Alves, I'd like to invite you. to join our discussion.
Hey, everybody, thank you so much for your presentations, amazing, amazing interventions. My intervention is very short here. I think all that would have been said has been already said wonderfully by our colleagues. I just want to thank all of you for your effort. Doing activist research is not easy, it's not for everybody, we know that. For white scholars from the global north, do activism is different because just extra work that they are doing. But when you embrace activism as part of our daily lives, a part of our practice, that is where challenge comes, right? And I have only to thank all of you. Also recognize the challenges that all of us face, the challenge, the shortcomings that any research has, and ours not different. But at the same time, I wanted to emphasize something that Wangi Kimari said that's very important, is that the opportunity to have a conversation that is not intercepted by the Global North Academy, although some of this money comes from the Global North. And I'm sure we also replicate some of these ideas when we also using some scholars from the Global North to trying to understand the present moment. And yet, I think that's an amazing opportunity to have Brazil, Colombia, and Kenya, three different points of the African diaspora in dialogue, trying to understand these conditions that all of you have already said very well. No need to repeat it here, but also the pedagogies, the strategies of resistance. In that sense, I want to emphasize Juan David's contribution here about self-preservation. That in this moment, activist research is all also about self-preservation. And this self-preservation comes in the form of organizing a healthy community, food security, trying to provide the basic for food security, all these things, but also for our own well-being as scholars in these extraordinary time, extraordinary moments. So I would like just to thank you all. Thank you, Amanda Pinheiro, for your amazing work, tireless effort to make all this happen. I and Terence Uten, I think he would agree, we have a very minor role here since the beginning. We are just behind the scene trying to support in some way. But we would like to thank again the Dean of Social Science, Dr. Charlie Hale, Dr. Paul Amar from the Ofaela Center, the Center for Black Studies Research, and the Black Studies, the Department of Black Studies for the support. And of course, the SESRC, the COVID-19 initiative for the support for making this conversation happen. And I hope this is just the beginning of some long-standing dialogue that we must have among us in the so-called Global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alves. I'd like to thank all our PIs, research activists that were on the floor, exposing ourselves, exposing yourselves much more than us here. And thank you so much for letting us know what's happening in these three sites. And it was a pleasure to work with you all on these. So for the sake of time, I have to wrap it up this talk, but I hope to see you all again. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thanks for this very rich discussion and necessary. We really have to talk about that. I hope to see you all, and hopefully we can keep going with this project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
Gracias a todas.
Gracias, Juan. Cuídate. Oh, wow. I think I'm going to just stop